Before you is a recording from December 3rd, 2024. In it, the sitting president of South Korea declares martial law in the country.
세력의 위협으로부터 자유 대한민국을 수호하고 우리 국민의 자유와 행복을 약탈하고 있는 자유 헌정 질서를 지키기 위해
But just 6 hours after this announcement, he was forced to revoke it. The president was barred from leaving the country and became a suspect in a treason case.
그러나 조금 전 국회의 계엄 해제 요구가 있어 계엄 사무에 투입된 군을 철수시켰습니다.
Were you surprised? For some reason, we're used to thinking of North Korea as the epitome of dictatorship, a place no one in their right mind would want to live in. Meanwhile, its southern neighbor, still technically at war with it, the Republic of Korea, stands out against the unattractive northern sister as a technological paradise whose culture permeates every corner of the world. But if you take a closer look, you'll see that South Korea is far from a paradise. Over the past 70 years, 4 out of the country's 13 presidents have faced trial for corruption, with one even given a death sentence.
Bribery, abuse of power, coercion, and leaking government secrets.
17 years in prison for corruption, bribery, and embezzlement.
Such political games stem from the fact that South Korea's success is backed by just a few powerful families who today control half the country. In the 1950s, these were small family businesses dealing in noodle supplies and car repairs. But with government support, they lifted the country from the ashes of the Second World War and grew into some of the world's largest corporations that you must be very familiar with: Samsung, Hyundai, LG, and others. While these companies may be known to you as producers of household appliances and cars, in South Korea they do everything, from food production to building high-speed highways and manufacturing heavy weaponry. Today, the heads of these corporations are implicated in corruption deals worth hundreds of billions of dollars.
Local court has approved an arrest warrant for Samsung's heir apparent Lee Jae-yong in connection to the massive corruption scandal gripping Korea.
Under their influence, presidents are replaced, and more than half of young South Koreans, aged 20 to 40, believe they have no chance of building a successful career. How did South Korea turn into a bright facade of prosperity, hiding decades of economic missteps by its leaders? Let's find out. Right between China and Japan lies a small peninsula. Today, it is home to North and South Koreas, but just over 100 years ago, a completely different state existed here: Joseon, or the land of the morning calm. Joseon, like Japan and China, lagged significantly behind Europe. This was because Eastern countries had long resisted opening up to the outside world. However, while China and Japan eventually modernized to avoid becoming European colonies, the small state of Joseon fell under Japan's influence. And while China was embroiled in civil wars, Japanese authorities treated Joseon much like the United States had recently treated Japan. In 1876, the Japanese arrived on Joseon's shores and forced its government to sign a treaty granting Japan free access to 3 ports: Busan, Incheon, and Wonsan. This gave Japan a new market for its goods and a strategic foothold near its main rival, China. Japanese textiles flooded the Joseon market, while cheap rice, the staple food for Japanese factory workers, flowed from Joseon to Japan. Realizing Joseon's growing dependence on Japan, China advised the peninsula's rulers to make agreements with countries other than Japan. Thus, the United States, Britain, Italy, and Russia entered the land of morning calm. These nations saw Joseon both as a promising new market and as a weak competitor they could leverage to strengthen their position in Southeast Asia. Joseon itself began transforming from a feudal village economy into a capitalist one, resulting in rapid societal stratification. The influx of cheap textiles bankrupted local weavers, and food prices rose because landowners now sold rice for export. While some built houses with clay and grapevines, others could afford taxis and servants. Previously, everyone lived modestly but equally. Now, most of the population became poorer while foreigners took control of the country. This laid the groundwork for a peasant revolution of Joseon in 1894. To suppress it, the authorities sought military assistance from China, which had long been Joseon's protector and elder brother. At this point, Japan realized it could lose its influence over Joseon, and under the pretext that China's intervention was illegal, sent its own troops. Thus began the First Sino-Japanese War, with Japan, more modernized and militarily prepared, won. Under the peace treaty, China ceded Taiwan to Japan and recognized Joseon as an independent country, effectively relinquishing its protectorate status. Given full autonomy, Joseon's king renamed the state to the Korean Empire in 1897 and declared himself its first emperor. Of course, Korea did not truly become an empire, but the adoption of this title was intended to elevate Korea's international status as a fully independent nation. Despite its nominal independence, Korea effectively became a Japanese protectorate. Pro-Japanese officials held key government positions, and most industrial assets were in Japanese hands. In 1905, Japan secured its dominance over Korea by neutralizing competition from Russia and the United States. Russia signed a peace treaty recognizing Korea as Japan's sphere of influence, while the US conceded Korea to Japan after Japan renounced claims to the Philippines. By the early 20th century, Korea was under Japan's monopoly, which began enforcing aggressive assimilation policies. Koreans were forced to learn Japanese, change their religion, and give their children Japanese names. However, this period in Korean history cannot be viewed as entirely negative. It was a time of economic growth. Agricultural, fishing, and industrial production increased nearly tenfold. Seoul gained electricity, trolley buses, plumbing, telephones, and even telegraphs. Japan built major factories, schools, and railroads in Korea. By 1900, most Koreans still traveled in wooden carts. By the start of the Second World War, over 6,000 kilometers of railroads had been built. Of course, Japan did this primarily for its benefit, turning Korea into a compliant supplier of resources and a ready market for Japan's goods. Yet, the foundations of modern South Korea's economy were laid during the Japanese colonization period. Meet Lee Byung-chul. His name might not mean much to you, but you undoubtedly know the name of his company. You might even be watching or listening to this video from a product of his brand at this moment. Lee Byung-chul founded Samsung, the same Samsung that today makes foldable phones and designs the world's tallest skyscrapers, from the Burj Khalifa in the UAE to the Lakta Center in Russia. But back then, Samsung, now the biggest corporation of South Korea, was but a small office in the city of Daegu. In the 1930s, it dealt in rice flour, dried fish, and noodles, exporting them to China. Another Korean, Ko In-hwe, in the 1940s was involved in production of tooth powder. At that time, most Koreans brushed their teeth with plain salt, so the tooth powder quickly became a hit. From this would later emerge the legendary toothpaste Lucky, which would become so popular that the name itself would be synonymous with any toothpaste in Korea. However, I'll tell you more about this toothpaste a bit later, because you can't even imagine what Going Hue's company would become. Finally, another enterprising Korean, Chang Ji-young, ventured into car repair, and not without reason. In the 1930s and 1940s, outdated Japanese and American cars were the primary means of transportation in Korea, requiring frequent maintenance and repairs. To seize this opportunity, Chang Ji-young took out a loan and bought a workshop, gradually growing his business. However, during the height of World War II, the Japanese government seized the auto repair shop, merging it with a steel plant. By the way, what was happening in Korea during World War II? The country was essentially a Japanese colony, exploited for resources. Koreans were forcibly made to work in military factories, on construction projects, and even serve in the Japanese army. But as you know, Japan lost World War II. After the surrender of the Great Asian Empire, the Korean peninsula was liberated from occupation. And now we can turn the page to the next chapter of Korea's history, where it would be torn apart by two other superpowers. In 1945, Korea was liberated from Japanese occupation by Soviet and American forces and was intended to become a democratic country with an elected president. Until then, the USSR and the US agreed to divide spheres of influence. Everything north of the 38th parallel on the globe was controlled by the Soviet military administration, while everything south was under US control. This division occurred on August 10, 1945. Even after Japan's formal surrender on September 2, 1945, the USSR and the US couldn't agree on how to organize elections in Korea. Each power sought to establish a government in Korea that was loyal to their ideology. Thus, in the north, the Soviet Union built a socialist system and supported local communist leaders. In the south, the US implemented democratic institutions and backed pro-Western politicians. Ultimately, no compromise was reached. In 1948, under the auspices of the UN, presidential elections were held in the southern part of the peninsula, resulting in the establishment of the Republic of Korea. In response, the Soviet Union established the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the northern part of the peninsula just 1 month later. Kim Il-sung, the grandfather of North Korea's current leader, Kim Jong-un, was appointed as its prime minister. Naturally, these were two entirely different political systems. Each side considered its region the real Korea, viewing the other as traitors. In 1950, war broke out between the sides, which lasted 3 years and ended in an armistice. Since then, the two Koreas have been separated by a demilitarized zone and remain technically at war, as no peace treaty has been signed to this day. The Korean War plunged both countries into a deep economic crisis, from which they began to rise up in different ways. If you look at the physical map of the Korean peninsula, you'll see mostly mountains and hills. Only about a third of its territory is suitable for agriculture. While the north was fortunate to have a significant amount and variety of mineral resources, the south was not. The combined value of resources in South Korea was estimated to be around 20 times less than the north. With these resources and support from the USSR, North Korea began building large steel plants and electrifying its region. Meanwhile, the US couldn't allow South Korea to lag behind North Korea. It was a race of ideologies that couldn't be lost. From 1954 to 1959, the US provided South Korea with about $1.5 billion in subsidies and initiated large-scale privatization. Large landowners were forced to sell their plots, which were then sold to farmers at below market prices. This allowed more farmers to own land, reducing social inequality. Remember Chang Ji-young, the one whose auto repair shop was confiscated by Japanese authorities during the war? In 1946, After the occupation ended, he reopened a similar business as the demand for car repairs in post-war Korea had only grown. Using his modest savings and deep understanding of the business, he founded the company called Hyundai, which means modern in Korean. The Korean economy grew, and so did Chung's business. By 1950, Hyundai was repairing not only cars, but also taking on projects to rebuild infrastructure and construct barracks for thousands of American soldiers. By the end of the Korean War, Chung's company had become a major contractor for the Americans and gained access to construction equipment that competitors lacked. This enabled Hyundai to secure the largest government contracts for construction, as competitors lacked both experience and resources. Another businessman, Lee Byung-chul, the one who ran the grocery trading company Samsung, was forced to flee Seoul during the Korean War because his warehouses were burned down by the North Korean army. Once South Korea regained control of Seoul, Lee leveraged his connections to win government contracts to supply essential goods like noodles, sugar, and fish. Lee Byung-chul wasn't an ordinary Korean. His father was a friend of South Korea's first president. Soon, Samsung built a sugar refinery in Sudong, which eventually became South Korea's largest food conglomerate. In 1954, Samsung opened the country's largest woolen fabric factory, and in 1958, acquired a bank and an insurance company to streamline its operations. This is how businesses in post-war Korea grew quickly with the right connections. Ko In-hwa, the creator of the popular tooth powder Lucky, founded the Lucky Chemical Company after World War II. The company began producing facial cream. This new product allowed him to transform the tooth powder into Korea's first toothpaste, also called Lucky. Its popularity was largely due to the fact that in 1953, Lucky packaged the toothpaste in plastic containers instead of glass or porcelain like competitors. To achieve this, Lucky Chemical Co. opened Korea's first plastic manufacturing plant, producing not only toothpaste packaging but also soap dishes, combs, and even water pipes. You might wonder why the government allowed such monopolies to form. Reason was simple. Korea needed to quickly develop heavy industries and technology to escape poverty, and small private firms couldn't compete with international companies. The government saw an opportunity to rapidly develop industries not through free market competition from scratch, but by supporting established businessmen who just needed a little assistance. In 1958, the monopolist Lucky Chemical Industrial Co. created a company called Gold Star to produce household appliances for Korea's domestic market, reducing reliance on imported electronics. A year later, Gold Star produced Korea's first radio and shortly after, its first domestic fans. By the late 1960s, Gold Star had produced Korea's first refrigerator, air conditioner, and even elevator. You may wonder where this company is now. It's actually pretty interesting. In 1995, Gold Star and Lucky Chemical Industrial Co. merged to form Lucky Gold Star, or LG for short. Samsung also entered the home appliance market, focusing on televisions. Meanwhile, Hyundai was constructing Korea's largest structures, including the Soyang Dam, the Seoul-Busan Expressway, and the world's largest shipyard. Hyundai eventually transitioned from car repairs to manufacturing vehicles, releasing its first car in collaboration with Ford. A few years later, Koreans produced their first domestically made car, the Hyundai Pony. Companies like Hyundai, Samsung, and the future LG were managed by family clans. At a time when there was nothing in this country except the opportunity to capture the market, they were the first to do so thanks to their connections and experience. Government support then turned them into the country's largest businesses. These companies were called chaebols, a term that translates to rich family. It was very convenient for the authorities to work with them. Take Samsung Electronics for example. It always repaid its debts because it was backed by the parent Samsung company, which owned food production, insurance, and banking businesses. The government had been working with these families for years. It was easier to trust them than new faces. And isn't it simpler to finance and manage 10 companies instead of 100? In general, the chaebols had everything they needed to grow, and so they did. In 1973, they accounted for about 10% of the country's GDP. By the late 1970s, this figure had risen to 16%, and another decade later, it was 33%. The final step in monopolizing South Korea's economy came with a reduction in American aid. In the 1960s, the US became involved in the Vietnam War, and funding for South Korea decreased significantly. Meanwhile, the threat from North Korea remained. Starting in the 1970s, South Korea began producing military equipment. Who could handle this task better than the chaebols? Practically no one. So don't be surprised by Hyundai tanks or Samsung and Kia howitzers. The original plan succeeded. The chaebols, thanks to their scale, technology, and cheap labor, produced affordable goods. They actively exported their products, earning foreign currency to purchase overseas technologies and equipment. South Korea's economy grew at an astonishing pace. The once poor agrarian nation became a hub of innovation and science. However, the government's reliance on family monopolies turned out to be a fatal mistake. Simple solutions always come with a price. For South Korea, that reckoning came swiftly. Imagine you are the president of a country with a population of 40 million and a relatively weak economy. You face a choice. Give the market freedom, allowing competition to cultivate the most efficient companies over decades, or support existing businesses, betting on them for economic growth. What would you choose? The South Korean authorities chose the second, simpler path. They enabled the country's most influential families to quickly dominate the domestic market before foreign competitors could. However, this led to these families entangling the entire South Korean economy with their networks of influence. A clear example is Hyundai. In 2004, Hyundai was headed by Chung Mong-koo, the founder's son. He directly owned other companies like Glovis, specializing in logistics, and Changwon, focused on defense. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Digging deeper, you find that Chung Mong-koo held stakes in Hyundai Motor Company, which produces cars, and Hyundai Mobis, which manufactures auto parts. These companies, in turn, controlled a majority stake in Kia. Ini Steel and B&G Steel, Korea's largest steel manufacturers, supplied Hyundai and Kia with the steel needed for car production. This network allowed Chung family to influence entire sectors of South Korea's economy through their industrial and financial connections. In exchange for turning a blind eye to monopolization, the government received billions of dollars in financial support from the chaebols. The pinnacle of the business-government alliance in South Korea was the wedding of the century in 1988, when the daughter of the sitting president married the eldest son of the chairman of Sunghyun Group, the second largest chaebol in South Korea after Samsung.
유학생이던 최태원 노소영 부부는 100년 가약을 맺습니다. 현직 노태우 대통령의 장녀와 결혼식장은 청와대 영빈관이었습니다.
Surprisingly, from the 1990s to the present day, 3 South Korean presidents have been sentenced to imprisonment and one even to death. The reason? Corruption. The recent president of South Korea, 64-year-old Park Geun-hye, was removed from office following impeachment, a routine occurrence in South Korea. She was accused of extorting bribes from the leadership of the country's largest corporations, including Samsung. In 2018, the son of Samsung's owner, the head of Samsung Electronics, was sentenced to 5 years in prison after bribing the president's confidant. As for the president herself, she was sentenced to 25 years in prison. At this point, you might ask, well, corruption exists everywhere. Why aren't South Koreans fine? At least they're fighting it there. Look, they put presidents in prisons and the government is constantly changing. But what if I told you that none of the presidents were executed or even served their full terms? They were all pardoned within a few years. In 2018, Park Geun-hye was sentenced to 25 years for corruption, but in 2021, she was pardoned by the new president and released. Interestingly, some of these cases were investigated by the current president of South Korea, Yoon Suk-yeol. During the national corruption scandal, he worked in Seoul prosecutor's office. Yet, despite this work, when Yoon Suk-yeol became president, he did not initiate any radical reforms regarding chaebols or corruption eradication. Really does give you a feeling of deja vu. As for the chaebols themselves, this lack of accountability and their monopolistic position have rendered them extremely inefficient. By the mid-1990s, the debt ratio among chaebols had reached 500 to 700%. To give you a clearer picture of just how critical the situation was, let me provide a simple example. Imagine you own an apartment worth $150,000, a car worth $20,000, and savings of $10,000. These are all your assets, totaling $180,000. At the same time, you owe $130,000 on your mortgage, $15,000 on your car loan, and $8,000 in credit card debt. Altogether, your debts amount to $153,000. If you subtract your debts from your assets, you are left with a net worth of $27,000. Now divide your debts by your net worth and you get a ratio of 567%. This was roughly the situation South Korean chaebols found themselves in. On paper, they had assets, but those assets were acquired through loans that they had no clear way of repaying. The massive loans and low efficiency combined with their monopolistic positions turned chaebols into ticking time bombs, which inevitably exploded during the Asian financial crisis of 1997. Not only South Korean chaebols, but also companies in Singapore, Hong Kong, and Taiwan had accumulated so much foreign debt over previous decades that when the growth rates of these economies slowed due to competition from Japan and China, the Asian tigers collapsed. Once it became clear that companies in South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Taiwan couldn't sustain the debts they had taken on, large international speculators began selling off the currencies of these countries and the securities of their companies. At this time, the US dollar strengthened significantly. It rose by 30% in comparison with major global currencies between 1995 and 2002. This meant trouble for Asian countries not only because their economies were slowing down, but also because their foreign currency debts grew due to the changing exchange rates. Foreign investors lost faith in the bright prospects of Asian markets and started selling local currencies and dumping stocks of Asian companies. This withdrawal of investor support triggered widespread bankruptcies of major corporations and banks, a decline in production, and rising unemployment. In South Korea, there was a sharp increase in suicides, particularly among working-age men. Within just a few months, the South Korean won lost half of its value against the US dollar. The strength of large South Korean corporations, where they could financially support one another because they belonged to a few families, became their Achilles heel. Companies fell like dominoes because the crisis affected them all similarly. In 1997, 11 chaebols went bankrupt. including Kia and Daewoo, while 10 others teetered on the brink of collapse. In 1998, the bankrupt Kia Corporation was purchased by Hyundai, another chaebol. The following year, Daewoo was liquidated by the South Korean government, and its remaining divisions were acquired by foreign companies.
I think that we do see there's a seriousness that is being taken by the chaebol owners at this point, and hopefully they're going to be completed on a sensible commercial basis.
This restructuring revitalized South Korea, and by year 2000, the economy not only stabilized, but even began to grow, although not for long. Since the 2000s, the impact of chaebols has been felt not by just South Korea's economy, but also by its citizens. News stories about the arrogance of wealthy families' children began to surface more frequently. For instance, the daughter of the chairman of Korean Air, South Korea's largest airline, made headlines for throwing nuts at a flight attendant on a plane because she was dissatisfied with the service.
The alleged incident came to light just a few days after her elder sister Cho Hyun-ah, who infamously delayed a flight back in 2014 because her macadamia nuts were served in a bag, not on a dish.
The young leader of the Daelim Group, a construction and petrochemical conglomerate, once demanded that his driver remove the rearview mirror so their eyes wouldn't meet in the reflection. Overall, the level of inequality in South Korea isn't particularly critical, around 33% on the Gini index, comparable to France or Spain. However, in South Korea, inequality is perceived very acutely by the population. It's no coincidence that the first South Korean film to win an Oscar, Parasite, highlights the disparity in living standards among ordinary South Koreans, and the series Squid Game is based on the struggle to escape poverty. This, let me remind you, is in a country that might appear to be a technological paradise and one of the best places to live in the world. While South Korea's elites reside in ultra-expensive skyscraper districts, drive Rolls-Royces, Porsches, and Bentleys, mingle with the local celebrities, and dine in lavish restaurants, some South Koreans in Seoul live exactly like the characters in popular South Korean media. The problem is that escaping poverty is nearly impossible. Truly high-paying jobs are offered by chaebols, but to secure one, you must win fierce competition. Parents enroll their children in private schools focused on preparing for entrance exams, and students hire tutors to excel in interviews for entry-level positions at Samsung or LG. Students without wealthy parents have to skimp on food and other basic necessities just to afford their education.
이렇게 직접 요리를 해 먹으면 돈을 많이 아낄 수 있거든요. 제가 계산을 해보니까 도시락 하나 싸는데 평균 500원 정도 되는 것 같아요. 놀고 싶죠. 놀고 싶고 연애하고 싶은데 지금 상황에 그렇게 해버리면 진짜 돌이킬 수 없을 것 같아서 조금 절제 많이 하고 있어요.
As a result, they live in a tiny 100 square foot apartments that cost $400 a month. And your next door neighbor living in an identical room studies 15 hours a day to perform better on exams than you. But let's say you're lucky. You were born into an affluent family, had tutoring twice a week, and graduated with straight A's from a university that cost your parents $20,000 a year. Even that doesn't guarantee you'll land the dream job you and your parents have envisioned for years. Due to the intense race for education, the market is extremely saturated with brilliant minds, and competition for positions at Samsung keep increasing.
Over 100,000 people this year alone have proven their desire to work at Korea's top conglomerate, Samsung.
On an early Sunday morning, this large group of people is heading toward a local school ground. They're not adolescents looking for extra credit. They're job applicants to Korea's largest company, Samsung. Working for the conglomerate is considered a dream job as it offers stability, benefits, and good pay.
It's practically impossible to work outside of a chaebol because they are the main monopolists, and no other businesses offer the high salaries needed to recoup the cost of such an expensive education. As a result, a quarter of young people aged from 15 to 29 in South Korea remain unemployed. They can't secure high-paying jobs, and lower salaries wouldn't cover their educational expenses. 6 out of 10 South Koreans believe they have no chance of climbing the social ladder. This isn't just a feeling, it's a reality shaped by decades of social hierarchy where connections, education, and class status determine everything. But suppose you're fortunate enough to become an employee at a major conglomerate. The lifelong race doesn't end there. It only begins. Work isn't just means of earning a living. It becomes the meaning of life. If you falter, someone from the line waiting outside will quickly take your place. Under such pressure, South Koreans lead the world in rates of mental illnesses and suicide. Neither China nor even Japan, a country with extreme work ethic, has as many suicides as South Korea. Strong familiar expectations and societal pressures only add fuel to the fire. For many South Koreans, how others see me matters far more than how I see myself. As a result, the country not only has the highest suicide rate, but also one of the largest numbers of alcoholics. Interestingly, overall alcohol consumption in South Korea isn't extraordinary. The average South Korean drinks about 8 liters of alcohol a year, similar to residents of Thailand or Argentina. What's notable is not that the nation drinks heavily, but that the number of alcoholics is disproportionately high. A fifth of the population consumes 66% of all the alcohol in the country, having played a pivotal role in industrializing and integrating South Korea into the global economy, raising GDP per capita by 210 times. Chaebols have, in recent years, become the weakest link in the country's economy. They stifle small and medium-sized enterprises, restrict entrepreneurial freedom, and distort competition. Small and medium-sized businesses, which provide 83% of the country's jobs, face serious challenges. Chaebols leave them no chance. They either copy their ideas or outright buy them out. Consequently, income inequality widens, social dissatisfaction grows, and unemployment among the youth increases. Nevertheless, today's successful multi-billion-dollar family corporations like Samsung, LG, and Hyundai remain the backbone of South Korea, not only supporting the domestic economy, but also serving as pillars for political power. Despite scandals and criticism, little can be done to change their structure without risking the collapse of a system deeply embedded in South Korean culture and economy since the mid-20th century. This makes South Korea one of the most illustrative examples of an economy where behind a facade of prosperity lie fundamental societal and political problems that are nearly impossible to resolve.